The momentum is here and it's continuing. We had 2023 having the biggest year for school choice in the history of the movement, which parents got to see through remote learning, through Zoom school that did not work very well with math or reading, that something else was going on. The schools were focusing more so on the LGBTs than the ABCs, and parents didn't want to put up with it anymore, so they fought for school choice.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm Jesse Arm, Director of External Affairs here at the Manhattan Institute, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Our organization has been invested in the battle for education pluralism and a part of the school choice movement since its inception. And I'm happy to report that at a moment when not everything in the world of politics and policy seems to inspire optimism, the school choice movement is growing at a rapid pace. My guest today is one of the nation's most effective advocates for education freedom, someone who personally played a major role in a number of the movement's many legislative wins over recent years. Corey DeAngelis is a man of many affiliations. He is a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children, executive director at the Education Freedom Institute, a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a board member at the Liberty Justice Center. But despite affiliations with several different think tanks and peer organizations of ours, Corey is actually somewhat of an atypical policy professional, in that he is deeply invested not only in putting ideas on paper, but in applying an innovative approach to activism that helps see those proposals through to becoming law. Corey, welcome to Manhattan Insights.
Hey, Jesse, thanks so much for having me.
Corey, let's start with the basics. School choice, educational pluralism, education freedom. What do these things mean?
Yeah, it's any initiative that allows families education dollars meant for educating their children to follow them to the institution that best aligns with their values and meets their needs. So you could take your kids' education dollars to a public school if you want, but if school choice would allow you to take that funding to a private school to pay for tuition or fees, a charter school, or a home-based education option. It's the concept of the money following the child.
Can you tell me a little bit about what the current state of play with regard to school choice looks like in the United States? Do we have it? To what extent? What places do it best? What places do it worst?
Yeah, so over 30 states in the District of Columbia have some form of private school choice already, allowing the money to follow the child. But not all these states are universal, meaning that not all families are eligible. Typically, in the school choice movement for decades, we've seen incremental reform where it's been only for certain groups, lower income families or students with special needs. We've been moving the ball down the field, slowly getting first downs over the past couple of decades. But in the past couple of years, because the teachers' unions overplayed their hand by holding children's education hostage during the COVID era, by fighting to keep the schools closed as long as possible in exchange for multiple multi-billion-dollar ransom payments from the taxpayers, they overplayed their hand and families got to see that their system didn't care about their kids all that much while they were scrambling, trying to find a way to pay for private schools that were open just down the road, or try to figure out how to homeschool or create micro schools or pandemic pods with other families to figure it out. They also got to see an unintended benefit of remote learning, which we really should have just called it remotely learning because there wasn't a lot of learning going on, was that families got to see a little bit of what was happening in the classroom. And parents who thought their kids were in good public schools based on their test scores started to see another dimension of school quality that's arguably more important than anything that could be captured by a standardized test, which is whether the school's curriculum aligns with families' values. So those parents started to show up at school board meetings to try to participate in this idea of democratic accountability. In some cases, it didn't work. They had their mics cut off for reading things that were happening in the schools, explicit content that was in the public school library that was somehow okay around other people's children. But when they tried to talk about it at the school board meeting with adults, they got their mics cut off because it was inappropriate. If it was not okay to do it in the school board meeting, why is it okay for those concepts to be discussed in the public schools without the parents around? But they also went even further. You had the National School Boards Association colluding with the Biden administration, sent a letter to the Department of Justice implying that some parents who are upset at school board meetings should be investigated for domestic terrorism. That blew up in their face. They were trying to bully and silence parents into submission. It had the opposite effect. It only emboldened parents to push back even harder. And they also sought out other reforms that could solve their problems, including school choice, so that they could have more agency in that discussion with the school boards. Instead of them getting silenced or the school boards not wanting to listen to them, the parents had real power with school choice because they could say, hey, if you're not going to listen to me, you want to cut off my mic, I'm going to go take my money and my child to an institution, a private school that does listen to me, aligns with my values, and has an incentive to cater to our needs. And so we've had 10 states in the past 2 years alone pass universal, everybody eligible school choice. One of the first was Arizona. What you can do there is you can take the $7,000 of state funding for your child to the public school if you want. If you like your public school, you can keep your public school, but for real this time, unlike with your doctor. If not, that money goes into something called an education savings account, much like a health savings account, and you can use it for any approved education provider. It could be private schools. It could be used for special needs educational therapies, homeschool curriculum, private tutoring, and so on and so forth. You can't use it for frivolous activities like a big screen TV or things like that, but you can use it for education expenditures. And all these 10 states have legislatures that are controlled by the Republican Party. Arizona got it done with 1-seat GOP majorities. And now we have 1 in 5 states, red states, with universal school choice. So we're winning so much, I'm almost getting tired of winning, Jesse. But I'm not going to stop because we're only a fifth of the way there. We have a long way to go.
You touched on a lot of things that I'm going to ask you more about throughout this podcast, but let's pick up on that last note, momentum. A lot of people are saying that we're living in a school choice moment right now. Why is it now that the wind is at our backs so strongly? And I guess I'm also curious, why did it take so long to build this momentum? The school choice movement has been around since, well, I don't know, the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, the Milwaukee voucher programs, people credit as the first modern day program, started in the 1990s, and actually in 1990. But we've had voucher programs in the country as far back in Maine and Vermont in the late 1800s. They had town tuitioning programs for kids who didn't have any public schools in their district. The state gave the funding in the form of a voucher to parents to choose other public schools or religious or non-religious private schools. Those programs are still on the book today. But to get to the heart of your question, Jesse, the momentum is here and it's continuing. We had 2023 having the biggest year for school choice in the history of the movement, which was the same thing in 2022 and in 2021. We've been just having record-setting years each and every year since 2021. And it is really because the unions overplayed their hand and awakened a sleeping giant, which happens to be parents who want more of a say in their kids' education. I mean, Vodi Bakum said it best. We cannot continue to send our children to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come home as Romans. Well, the good news is the parents aren't surprised anymore. They've seen what's going on. They watch Libs of TikTok. They've seen the curriculum that doesn't align with their own family's values. And that's more likely to mobilize parents to fight for real, meaningful change than anything that could be captured by math or reading test scores, especially because the parents who are upset about the curriculum, they have kids in schools where they might be doing okay on their report card. They may have straight A's. They might be in an A-rated school according to the state metrics. But there's something deeper going on here where schooling has become an extension of parenting, and you have far left activists that have infiltrated the government school system who see it as a jobs program for adults, not an education initiative for kids, but more importantly and more nefariously, they see it as a way to raise other people's children without the consent of the parents. And parents got to see through remote learning, through Zoom school that did not work very well with math or reading, that something else was going on. The schools were focusing more so on the LGBTs than the ABCs, and parents didn't want to put up with it anymore, so they fought for school choice. The coalitions for school choice have shifted as well, whereas before I mentioned it was more incremental reform. It was focused on kids in objectively failing schools based on test scores in the inner cities more so. Now it's become an argument for people who want school choice for a variety of different reasons. And that's still a good argument for school choice, that there are kids in schools in Chicago where they have 0% proficiency rates. Same thing in places like Baltimore. That's still a good argument for school choice. But now you have low income, higher income, Republicans, Democrats seeing problems with the one size fits all government run monopoly that we call the public school system. And for all of these variety of different reasons, you have these coalitions coming together to push for meaningful change. And in fact, in red states, it's become a GOP litmus test issue. It's become a political winner. In Texas, where I live, we put school choice on the ballot on the Republican primary in 2022, and 88% of Republican primary voters supported it on the ballot in 2022, which was up 9 percentage points since the GOP in Texas put it on the ballot last time in 2018. It was at 79% support, which was still great, but has surged to 88% support on the most recent ballot in 2022. So, and we've seen momentum this way in the Georgia primary ballot as well. We've seen it with nationwide polling. All of the signals are moving in the direction of education freedom, and it's become a political winner. Milton Friedman, he said a lot of smart things, but one of the smartest things that he said was something along the lines of, this is a paraphrase, that the way that you change things is not by putting the right people into office. The way that you truly change things, I mean, that obviously helps if they agree with you and they want to push for the right policies, but the way that you truly change things is by creating a climate of public opinion where it becomes politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And in 2022, Jesse, there wasn't a red wave that was talked about a lot in the media. There wasn't a blue wave, but there was a school choice wave. 76% of the candidates supported by AFC, my organization, and our state affiliates won their races in 2022. And we didn't just play in the easy ones. We took out 40 of the 69 incumbents we targeted in state legislatures, which is the hardest thing to do in politics. And you don't have to take my word for it. You could look at the liberal tears in the New Yorker magazine, where the author lamented that she actually said this in the article, that education freedom candidates fared depressingly well in the midterms. Freedom, depressing. I mean,
yeah. They don't love freedom over there, huh? All right.
Right. Well, listen, but it's good news for parents, even though it's bad news for socialists who want to trap kids in their schools.
Fair enough. Well, you keep doing this thing where you get to things I want to ask you about later on. But I think before we go too deep down the policy rabbit hole and I ask you more questions about all that, it would probably be helpful for our audience to understand a little bit more about who you are and where you come from and why you chose to get so involved in this particular fight. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, I actually grew up in San Antonio, Texas, where I live now, and went to government-run schools all through K through 12. That might be why I made so many mistakes on this podcast today. It was my government school education. But no, to be real, I actually had the opportunity to go to something called a magnet school. A lot of states have these magnet schools where they're still schools that are run by the district, they're run by the local governments, but you're not assigned to them, so they don't have as much monopoly power as traditional public schools. And they can have admissions processes and standards and specialized curriculums that are interesting to the student body. And I felt like that was a good opportunity for me. It was actually on the physical campus of my assigned government schools that had a lot of the usual problems of fights and bullying and gang activity and drugs. And I was able to see the night and day difference for 4 years straight. And I feel like that was a good opportunity for me. At the time, I think it was rated in the top 20 public high schools in the country, according to Newsweek. I know there's a lot of different, rankings out there, so who knows what the others ranked it as. But it was a good opportunity, objectively, for me. And I feel like other families should have that choice, but it shouldn't be limited to schools run by the government. Why should you only be able to take your kids' education dollars to a a government-run institution. That's like saying you can have choice, you can choose whatever thing you want to drink at dinner as long as it's a Coke. Well, that's not a lot of meaningful choice, is it? You should be able to choose a private school, especially if you want a religious education as well, but even a charter school or even just a home-based education option, including micro schools. The money should follow the student, and that has gotten me really excited about school choice in my personal story. But I also started as an academic. I did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Texas at San Antonio in economics. And my eyes were opened wide there to the problems of monopolies, which are most pernicious in the government school system. In what other sector are you assigned to a producer based on where you live? And if you want to go somewhere else, you got to get up and move houses. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, if grocery stores were run that way, it would be like a communist nation where they wouldn't have any bread on the shelves because they'd have no incentive to provide the services to customers. In fact, if they did have anything on the shelves, it would probably be expired and cause food poisoning. Well, the good thing is we can vote with our feet. If a restaurant or a grocery store does a bad job, we can go somewhere else. We should apply that same logic to schooling, just like we do with any other industry in the country. And after I did my bachelor's and master's, I did my PhD at the University of Arkansas in education policy. And my first study there actually linked the Milwaukee Voucher Program, which started in 1990, to crime reduction by the time the students reached about 30 years of age. We had student-level data, followed them over time, found huge reductions in crime, also huge reductions in paternity disputes, which could be caused by out-of-wedlock births and teenage pregnancies. And that really got me interested in how freedom and education could shape not just academic outcomes, but also more holistic outcomes and long-term outcomes, such as not being involved with the criminal justice system, improving the mental health, reducing bullying, increasing safety and satisfaction, because parents are choosing schools for a lot of different reasons. School quality is multidimensional, and I think some of my earliest studies looking at these non-academic outcomes ties really well into this current school choice debate and why we're seeing the momentum, which is because parents started to see, well, look, schools aren't just about test scores. There's other things going on. There's indoctrination happening in some cases, and I don't want to send my kids to Caesar where I feel like they're being indoctrinated to hate me and my way of life and my family's values. Why would I want to send them to an institution where I feel like they're being brainwashed for 13 years? And so I think my initial experience with the school choice research ties in really well to the current push for school choice and why we're winning.
Absolutely. Some of your early academic work on the Milwaukee private school choice system and how it resulted in crime reduction later in life was really interesting to read, and I'm glad you brought it up and told us a little bit about it. You've had a few run-ins with someone named Randi Weingarten. Will you tell us a little bit about who that is and who? Well, I guess I'm telling here a little bit. I'm revealing, but will you tell us also a little bit about the big teachers unions in this country, who they are, why they are so powerful, and the nature of their relationship with the Democratic Party and the broader sort of intersectional left?
Yeah, the national teachers unions are basically an arm of the Democratic Party at this point, and they are part of an elaborate money laundering scheme where the funding is extorted from the taxpayer and then is funneled into the government-run schools staffed by the teachers unions by the Democrats in office. And then the teachers unions go and take that money and funnel it, almost all of it in the campaign contributions, go towards Democrat politicians. If you look at Randi Weingarten's union, she's the head of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the two largest teachers unions in the country, the other one being the National Education Association run by Becky Pringle. They're far left activist organizations. They don't give a crap about educating kids. They're more involved with other political pet projects that they have. And Randi Weingarten's union, according to Open Secrets data from this year, shows that so far 99.9% of their campaign contributions have gone to Democrats, not to independents or Republicans. And this has been this way for as long as we can tell by that data going back to 1990 over the past
But
three decades.
Why do they operate that way? I mean, that's not the way most unions operate. Unions who want, this is theoretically, at least on paper, just an interest group to do things like increase teacher pay. So why is it turned into such a bitterly partisan entity?
I mean, you have higher education institutions that indoctrinate the future educators into this Marxist ideology, and then they trickle down into the school system. And so a lot of the people who staff the teachers' unions are also tend to be more far left. And I think this is just the nature of public sector unions in a lot of cases in general, where this isn't only the teachers unions, the public sector unions in other areas too disproportionately donate to Democrat politicians. It just so happens that the teachers unions have some of the most skewed statistics towards the Democrat Party. I don't know where it started exactly. I just know, back looking as far as we can, it's been like this for a very long time. We have data going back to 1990 from Open Secrets, and the money laundering has been going on since then. This incestuous relationship between the Democratic Party and the teachers unions. It should be illegal. They're basically using public taxpayer dollars to lobby against the public, and they're using it for political donations. And they don't really care about educating the kids. I mean, Randi Weingarten, she really has been one of the best unintentional advocates for school choice we've ever seen, because she keeps stepping in it over and over again. I mean,
and you've had some interesting personal crossover with her. I mean,
yeah, we found some footage of her at one of their annual events with the Network for Public Education, another union front group, where she said something along the lines of, if you only listen to one thing that I say today, remember this name: Chris Rufo, who's affiliated with Manhattan Institute, and Corey DeAngelis. And she goes on to this rabbit hole talking about how we're just trying to divide everybody. No, we just want parents to have a say in their kids' education. You're dividing people by injecting politics into the classroom and not staying in your lane as a supposed educator. You can't even get the basics right, math, reading, and writing. And U.S. history scores came out on the Nation's Report Card pretty recently, and only found that 13% of U.S. students are proficient in U.S. history. It's an absolute embarrassment. After that came out, I woke up one morning to what I thought was a nightmare. It wasn't. I thought it was a Babylon Bee headline. It wasn't. It was actually a post from Randi Weingarten, where she was saying that she was in Ukraine going to the front lines to assess the situation. I mean, was she running away from the failures of the decades of learning loss on the Nation's Report Card that she's responsible for? Or is she really just going to show people that she's in it for the political virtue signaling? I think she still has the Ukrainian flag in her bio before the American flag. I don't know how that works, but why was the head of the teachers union in our country going to Ukraine? It just didn't make any sense. Hadn't the Ukrainian kids already suffered enough? I mean, she's already ruined our education system. I don't think anybody wants her to influence their education system as well. But she also was instrumental, I think, in Glenn Youngkin's victory in Virginia, where you had Terry McAuliffe, a former governor, basically an incumbent in a state that apparently went 10 points to Biden in 2020. Terry McAuliffe on the debate stage said, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach." That blew up in his face. Since that happened, the polls started to swing towards Glenn Youngkin, a Republican. He ended up winning with education voters by 6 points, and that was the number 2 issue in the election, according to CNN exit polling. And on the next day, CNN actually talked to a Virginia mom who said that Randi Weingarten stumping for Terry McAuliffe was the nail in the coffin moment for her, because Terry McAuliffe basically had the school closer being his campaign closer. And Randi Weingarten's on all over Twitter. She can't take any flack. She closes her replies like she closed the schools and tries to gaslight the American public to pretend that she even went before Congress saying that, they were fighting so hard to actually open the schools before anybody else in April of 2020. We all know that's BS. It doesn't pass the Smith test. She lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools in person. She was threatening strikes when districts were talking about reopening schools in person. She called President Trump's plan to reopen schools reckless, callous, and cruel. They were fear-mongering every step of the way. Her local affiliate, the Chicago Teachers Union, had a board member vacationing in Puerto Rico in person while saying it was too unsafe to go back to work in person. The same union, her local affiliate, Chicago Teachers Union, actually deleted a tweet claiming that the push to reopen schools is rooted in racism, sexism, and misogyny. They threw every fear-mongering thing at the wall to see what would stick to try to prevent the schools from opening so that they could extort more money from the taxpayers, because they would just say, hey, we're not open, and we've been failing for decades because we don't have enough money. It's the definition of insanity. They call for the same thing over and over again, and they expect different results. But I don't think the union bosses are expecting much of anything different, because they know the money's going to go towards administrative bloat, and the people at the top, like Randy Weingarten, who make over $500,000 a year to trap your kids in her failure factories, the dumpster fire of Chicago government schools, which the Chicago Teachers Union boss won't send her own children to. Stacey Davis Gates called school choice racist and also called school choice private schools segregation academies. And then just this past year, we found out that Stacey Davis Gates, the Chicago Teachers Union boss, pulled her kid out of the government school system and is sending her own child to a private school. So much hypocrisy. It's nonstop.
Okay, Randy Weingarten and her buddies are not fans. Duly noted. But there are, of course, people in the middle, people who are susceptible to arguments from both sides. I wanted to briefly share an anecdote with you. I was recently back home in my home state of Michigan, suburban Detroit, swing district within a swing state with a lot of swing voters, speaking with a friend of mine's mom, just sitting casually around the island in the kitchen. This is somebody who I would think, broadly speaking, you and I should consider part of our political coalition, if not an attainable part of a political coalition. Somebody who's probably voted for Republicans most of their life, maybe isn't a huge fan of Donald Trump, votes for the occasional moderate Democrat here and there. But I was really surprised, because this is someone who, broadly speaking, I think is in my community, shares my values, same view of the world. When we got to talking about my work and what I'm up to in New York and Washington, and the topic of education policy came up, and she basically started speaking to me with, textbook teachers union talking points. She was very concerned about the precipitous decline in public school enrollment and worried, A, that was necessarily a bad thing, and B, that school choice was to blame. She worried about public schools being defunded as a result of funding going toward school choice programs. And I'm sorry to say that I've almost been in policy think tank, center-right world so long that school choice is almost like a basic truth, right? Like, I almost felt like, really? You really think that? Like, I don't know where even to begin to refute these arguments. But of course, it is important to refute these arguments. And I guess I'm wondering, A, what is the best way to do so? And B, can you also steelman some of those arguments, right? Like, what is the most charitable way to frame the teachers union's position of opposition toward a lot of school choice innovations?
Yeah, their main argument can be summed up as follows: that if parents get a choice to go to anywhere else than the government-run schools, then families are going to flee them immediately. There's going to be a mass exodus, and because public schools are funded based on enrollment counts, they're going to lose some funding. So their argument is that school choice will defund public schools. I have a couple of responses to that. One is that school choice doesn't defund public schools at all. If anything, public schools defund families. School choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners, or at least the intended beneficiaries of that funding, the families and their children. Education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. My other response is more of a rhetorical question. If you're having a conversation with someone, is you can say, well, why would that happen? Why would giving families a choice defund the public schools? I thought you said that your public schools are great and they're doing a fantastic job. You love your public school. It's part of your community and everybody wants to go there, right? Why would giving families an exit option cause a mass exodus? Why would people run the other way when given the opportunity? And they'll sit there a second and they'll kind of have a mental breakdown, or they'll just kind of glitch a little bit because they hadn't really thought about this before, because the only rational response to that question reveals why we should have school choice, not why we should not have school choice. And they'll have to say...
I'm sorry to cut you off, but perhaps it could be worse, right? I mean, there's some cognitive dissonance here. I mean, candidly, this is somebody who sent at least some of their children to private school. So there may even be a mentality here of like, well, it was right for me and my family and we could afford it, but I don't necessarily feel that option should be available to everyone. We haven't created an alternative reality yet. I know obviously we're on the upswing and we're scoring all of these wins, but we have not yet sketched out a picture of a society for people where everyone can choose what type of education is best for their kids.
Right. So one of the responses to the question of why would people flee is some people will say, well, they'll either have to say, well, I don't like the public schools. They're not doing a good job. And that's an admission of failure. But it could also be something to do with elitism and not thinking the masses can choose. I've actually heard some people say, well, it's not that the private schools are better, even though I send my kids to those institutions and I can figure out how to choose. It's because now you're saying low-income families should be able to choose too. I'm not saying that your friend is making this argument at all, but I've seen legislators make this argument, is they'll say, well, they don't have the information. They're not education experts. They can't figure it out like I can, or like the teachers in the school system. And I think that's kind of the soft bigotry of low expectations, because families care, even low-income families care and know about their kids' educational needs more than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away, people who don't even know their kids' names. How can they figure out the best education for them if they can't even figure out basic facts about other people's children? The parents have the on-the-ground knowledge, and they also have the best incentives to get the decision right because it's their own kids. And also, I mean, this is a taxpayer savings we have to understand as well. Yes, your friend might have, been paying out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. Well, she shouldn't have to pay twice. First of all, she should get the benefit as well. It should be open to everybody. And we're seeing states going universal on school choice, not picking winners and losers as much anymore, and having everybody access the funding. But also, it's a fraction of what would have been spent in the public schools. In Chicago, I believe they spend about $30,000 per student per year. It might be even more now. And it's typically the state portion of funds that follow the student. So it's usually about half of the money follows the student. So you can save taxpayer money. You can allow for more competition and freedom. And this also improves the public schools too. We have 29 studies on this subject. 26 of those 29 find positive effects of school choice competition on the outcomes in the public schools. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. We saw this in Florida too, where they've been expanding school choice for a long time. They now have universal as well as of last year, and they now have over 400,000 students signed up for scholarships in Florida. I mean, people want this. People are using and utilizing these programs, but they've found that a couple of decades ago, before they meaningfully expanded school choice, they were at the bottom of the pack on the nation's report card. But now, according to the latest data reported by Urban Institute, they have something called the America's Gradebook, where you can control for different student demographics across states to make apples-to-apples comparisons. They find that Florida, despite spending less than just about everybody else per student per year, they're knocking it out of the park in the top 5, depending on the outcome you're looking at, whether math or reading or 4th or 8th grade outcomes on the nation's report card, as they've massively expanded school choice. So this is a win-win solution. People who get the choice, obviously they benefit because they're getting, they know their kids, they're getting an opportunity to choose. That's the easy part of the question of school choice. The other side, the evidence is clear that the public schools get better too because they up their game in response to competition, just like every other industry.
Let's go a little bit deeper into the politics of school choice in both parties. So first, the Democrats. There are some high-profile Democrats in this country who have either supported certain private school scholarships to be made accessible for certain groups of students, or easing restrictions on the development of new charter schools, particularly in urban settings. But by no means has school choice become a core plank within the Democratic Party platform in the same way it has become one for Republicans. And then, of course, there's the specific case of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, a guy who I think wisely bear-hugged the school choice issue as a candidate running for the governorship. But when push came to shove, and he had the opportunity to sign into law a meaningful school choice reform, he ultimately elected to veto the legislation. What do you make of Democrats and their relationship to school choice broadly, and Shapiro in particular?
Yeah, look, Shapiro promised to veto his own campaign promise. It was a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it works out for him. I mean, he started to weasel around and try to pretend there was another reason besides him caving to the teachers unions who donated over $700,000 to his campaign the year before. He said it was because the House was controlled by the Democrats by like one vote. You're going to tell me you're the governor as a Democrat, you can't twist a couple of arms and get one vote from the Democrats to switch over and support what you're pushing for, especially after the Senate already passed the bill, a chamber that was controlled by Republicans. But I think it was ultimately a strong political move for him in the midterms because he quietly changed his education platform. And I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal right after it happened. And I caught some flack from conservatives saying, why are you supporting Shapiro? Why are you giving him attention for this? And I was not telling people to vote for Shapiro. Exactly. It doesn't matter which party it is. I'm going to advocate for school choice. Yes, Doug Mastriano was a stronger proponent of school choice, but I'm going to allow it. I'm not going to let anybody try to back out of a position that they publicly support. So I wanted to put a spotlight on Josh Shapiro doing this. So I did so in the national outlet, the Wall Street Journal. And my point was to say it doesn't matter why he changed his stance on school choice, whether he had a true change of heart or he was reading the tea leaves and looking at the polls. It's good news for parents in the long run that a high-profile Democrat in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, who was up by double digits in the polls already, felt compelled to signal support for school choice right before the election. Right after Doug Mastriano started calling Shapiro a hypocrite on school choice, he actually put a piece out saying, hey, Josh, you sent your kids to private school and went to private school. You don't support school choice. I do. Why are you a hypocrite kind of thing? And Josh Shapiro was smart politically. He was able to preempt those accusations of hypocrisy by supporting Lifeline scholarships in his platform, which Pennsylvania also had they had tens of thousands of students already using a more limited form of private school choice called the tax credit scholarship out there. So he was able to not alienate those constituents at the same time by supporting school choice. And about 77% of Tennessee school parents support school choice according to Morning Consult polling. So he did the right thing politically in that he knew he had to signal support for school choice. He even went on Fox News last year. I believe he was talking to Dana Perino, reiterating his support for Lifeline scholarships. And I think this gives us a little bit of a glimpse in how we get towards bipartisan support for school choice. Even though it wasn't a full-on success this time, it shows you that I think the way that we get there towards bipartisanship in the long run, you have to start with hyper-partisanship in the short run. We had Glenn Youngkin destroy Terry McAuliffe on the issue of education freedom and parental rights. And I think Josh Shapiro must have been looking over to Virginia saying, I don't want that to happen to me. Yeah, I'm up by double digits, but I don't want to be against parental rights in education. So I'm going to signal support for parents having a say in the form of school choice. And this happened with J.B. Pritzker as well, which is even more surprising. He is in a bluer state in Illinois, and he answered a candidate survey 3 weeks before the election in 2022, saying that he supported the Illinois private school choice program for lower income kids, the same program that he vowed to eliminate when he was running for governor in 2017 and in 2018. He said he supported that program. He did nothing to save it this past year. It actually got sunsetted, so it expired. He did tell the Chicago Tribune last year, though, that if a bill got to his desk, he would sign it. If the legislature could get it to him, he would save the program. But he probably knew, after speaking probably behind closed doors to House and Senate leadership, that bill was never going to get to his desk in the first place.
Yeah,
but that's besides the point, right? That he felt compelled to say, I support this program, is a long way. We've come a long way from Democrats just repeating the teachers union's talking point that school choice is bad and that it causes all these problems. Well, that's a good problem to have, that they're not following through. And it's not a great problem to have, but it's better than where we were before.
The intra-party Democratic debates around some of this are interesting to follow. I mean, it is true that it's less school choice rigidly, but there are charter advocacy groups that really shape races for school board and state legislature in one-party states like California and Illinois. That's the truth, right? I mean, some of these races come down to, again, for state legislature and school board in LA, Chicago, and the suburbs outside of it, essentially the charter candidate versus the teachers union candidate. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think in bluer states, you have New York City and New York and California. They do have some school choice in the form of charter schools, and tens of thousands of kids on wait lists in New York City alone, for example, where the latest data came out of New York City finding that black students in the charter schools outperformed their government-run school peers by about 20 to 30 percentage points on math and reading test scores. So they're really doing a good job for a fraction of the cost to taxpayers. In New York City, they spend about 80% of what they spend in the government-run schools per student. And they just do a phenomenal job academically. And that's why tens of thousands of kids are families have their kids on wait list begging for this better educational opportunity in these bluer areas. And I think that's a constituency that exists that the politicians have to listen to. They're their own form of an interest group. I wouldn't call them a special interest group. I'd say that they are a general interest group because they're parents fighting for their own kids. And you have the charter school operators as well. But it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem. If you don't have school choice to begin with, it's hard to get that constituency built up. But this is why I've said that as we've passed these universal school choice programs in red states, you should get as many people signed up for these initiatives as possible to create a new interest group to protect the program as much as you can. I think they've done a good job with this, with charter schools across the country enrolling over 3.2 million students. According to the older data, it's probably a lot higher now. About 6% previously of the school-age population was in a public charter school, which is pretty substantial.
Right. Well, I am a conservative who, I make that no secret. I'm a conservative, though, who believes heartily in heaping praise on Democrats and liberals when they do the right thing and on knocking Republicans when they do not do the right thing. So that brings me to asking you about the Republican Party and the political lens through which they view school choice. There are GOP opponents of school choice. They are mostly, well, I don't want to generalize too much, but from what we've seen nationally so far, they are primarily concentrated in rural areas. They are often people who take money from teachers' unions, but oftentimes, in their defense, local teachers' unions in parts of Texas have sort of disentangled themselves from the progressive social issue political posturing that national teachers unions organizations engage in. And that results in a dynamic where you have Republicans in state capitals across the countries who have proved to be obstacles for passing meaningful school choice legislation. I am curious what we do about that. And I'm curious in particular what your organization, AFC, is kind of developing as a response to, for lack of a better term, strike the fear of God into some of these lawmakers in the same way the teachers union has done for the Democratic Party. And I guess also, just a cherry on top of all of that, does it make sense to make the, we've seen some issues with Republicans forcing litmus tests on their candidates across all geographies across the nations. Do you believe that making school choice a litmus test for Republican lawmakers in this country is the right tactical move?
I think it's the right tactical move, and it's not me that's controlling it as a GOP litmus test. It's the actual parents on the ground.
Yes.
And if you look at the outcomes in the elections, it's showing that for Republicans in particular, school choice is a litmus test. I'm just calling it like I see it. It's not that I'm controlling all of this and saying that it ought to be a litmus test. It's just that's what the voters are demanding. In Texas, like I pointed out, they went from 79% support, which is already high, to 88% support on the 2022 ballot among Texas Republican primary voters. This happened in Georgia as well. They put it on the ballot. The Democrats never put it on the ballot for whatever reason, probably because they'll find out that their voters also support school choice, and that'll create a lot of problems for them. But in Georgia, they went from... Right. 73% to 79% in Georgia, so a huge swing there as well. It was already highly favored among their primary voters, too. And if you look at places, I just got back from Tennessee. I was pushing for school choice in Nashville, where Governor Bill Lee he just did a state of the state pushing for education freedom, universal school choice. It looks like it's going to happen there. But in their elections in 2022, in their primaries, you had 10 of the Republicans running in the House primaries that were either endorsed or funded by the teachers unions. 9 of them lost. Accepting the teachers union support has become a political kiss of death in some state primaries, including what we saw in Tennessee unfold in 2022. You look at what happened in Iowa in 2022. They also had Governor Reynolds pushing a school choice bill that was limited to just a few thousand kids. It got past the Senate very easily. With only one Republican defecting and joining all the Democrats, but it's a deep red state, so it was a vast majority passed it through the Senate. No matter how hard Governor Reynolds tried to push to get it across the finish line in the House, despite the House being controlled by 60% of members who had an R next to their name, could not get it done. After the primary elections, they got a new House and passed a universal school choice program early in January of 2023, becoming the first state to do so last year. And the joke in Iowa is that the Democrats should have supported the program in 2022 because it was more limited to just a few thousand kids. And what they ended up with, because the voters were paying attention, was a new legislature that was very happy to immediately pass universal school choice, every single family, regardless of background. They went all in 2023. So maybe I thought Texas would have learned from Iowa and said maybe we should do the same thing and pass universal school choice. Now you have 21 so-called Republicans in the Texas House who voted against school choice after it passed the Senate very easily, 18-13. 16 of those guys are running for election. Only five of them saw the writing on the wall and figured this is probably not a good idea. I'm going to retire early. And then the other 16 all have primary opponents who support school choice. And Governor Abbott, Ted Cruz, they're all backing a bunch of the challengers to the incumbents who voted against school choice. So we'll see how it turns out in Texas too. But the elections have gone in the favor of school choice advocates, not the opponents. And the argument that they make about it being a rural, they're in a rural area, so I'm going to have my cake and eat it too. I'm going to say I'm a Republican while voting against my own party platform. That is just an excuse, and it's not working anymore. But the they say two things that are logically incompatible with one another. The legislator will say, on the one hand, we can't use school choice because we already have fantastic public school, and that's the only option, by the way. We don't have any private schools. But in the next breath, with a straight face, they'll try to tell you school choice is going to decimate my fantastic rural public school. Well, first of all, if it's so fantastic, you should have nothing to worry about. But two, which one is it? If you can't have any exit options, if no one's going anywhere else, your public school is not going to lose any money because they're funded based on how many kids are there. And so you're not going to lose any money associated with people leaving. You should be the last person arguing based on it defunding the public school that you're against school choice. These just so happen to be the same guys that were already endorsed or funded by the teachers unions. I believe all but one of the 16 running for re-election either had funding or an endorsement or both from the teachers unions, the state affiliate in Texas of the NEA, the Texas State Teachers Association. And one more thing on the rural point is that the University of Houston just had polling out a couple days ago where they splice out the numbers between rural versus urban and suburban. And one of the questions asked Republican primary voters if they would be more or less likely to vote for a Texas House incumbent who voted against school choice. And they called the school vouchers, because the University of Houston is just going to use the most loaded terms that they can. And they found even then that 60% of the Republican primary voters would be less likely to vote for an incumbent who voted against school choice, and only about 10 or 15% said the opposite. So this is a political winner. It's so obvious with all the polling, with the data that we have from recent elections, it becoming a litmus test issue. And it's not because I snapped my fingers and said this ought to be a litmus test. It's because the voters, particularly the conservatives, seeing what's happening in the classroom, started to be super energized to support education freedom. They're the ones determining what is and what is not a litmus test, not me.
So we mentioned the tendency of national teachers unions to wade into social and cultural debates, to take up arms with other interest groups on the intersectional left that are primarily concerned with social activism related to race or gender or other kind of issues that are really not pertinent to K through 12 basic education, a la reading, math, science, etc. A lot of this became apparent to parents, just how much it was pervading into classroom instruction, as you pointed out, during the COVID lockdowns, which ironically the teachers unions also promoted and advocated for and demanded. I guess, why do they do this? Why do they choose to take up this fight? And then, how real is this? We obviously just saw the story out of the Bay Area about these woke kindergarten consultants. That's their actual name of the entity, right? Take $250,000 in federal funds to push a curriculum in school for young.
Didn't their founder say that Israel shouldn't exist and that the United States
I believe that was
shouldn't
factored
exist?
into this failed reading program that they were teaching. Right? It's like Israel doesn't exist. Israel has no right to exist. The United States has no right to exist. We have to decenter whiteness. I'm not even sure what that means, and I seriously doubt a kindergartner has any idea. So I guess, what do you say to the folks that people who want to have answers regarding to what extent advocating for things like curriculum transparency or even more aggressive interventions to depoliticize curricula in K through 12 education, to what extent is that part and parcel with the school choice playbook? And what do you say to folks who say school choice is not enough? We have to go further to right all the wrongs in America's K through 12 education system.
Yeah, I think these ideas are not in conflict with one another, not mutually exclusive. You can do all of these things at the same time. So we should push to reform the public schools in the best way we can. We should have more curriculum transparency. We should have more accountability. Conservatives should try to run for school board and take over, even if they only are able to hold their seats for a certain period of time. But we also need bottom-up accountability too, for people voting with their feet, so that when you do go to a school board meeting and they cut off your mic, or when they try to label you as a domestic terrorist for disagreeing with their preferred policies, you should be able to vote with your feet, take your money with you. So, we should do all of these things. It's an all of the above approach. It's not an either or solution. And, I think some of the top-down solutions absolutely are a step in the right direction, but there are questions about enforceability and how that looks when the laws are already passed. So you think about critical race theory bans, for example. We've had videos coming out in my state, in Texas, and Tennessee, where I was just at, from Accuracy in Media. They're kind of like a Project Veritas undercover journalism group, but they've gone to Iowa, Idaho, whole bunch of these other red states, some of them that have banned CRT, where the public school administrators are admitting on these undercover videos that either if the state does pass a ban on CRT, they're going to do it anyway. They're going to teach through a CRT lens, but not call it that. Or they'll move the goalpost and say that it's social emotional learning. They'll redefine terms, call it student mental health services. Obviously, a ban should reduce the likelihood of it occurring, so it's not a fruitless endeavor. But for the instances where it's still happening, parents know it. They should be able to say, okay, you know what? When I go to the school board meeting, you're going to listen to me, or I'm going to go somewhere else because I have school choice. We should introduce top-down and bottom-up accountability at the same time. So, I think the people who say these things that we shouldn't only be pushing for school choice. Great. I'm gonna do the school choice fight. I'll agree with you in your fights with other types of reforms as well. But I like to stay in my lane as much as possible. I like that Chris Rufo is taking an all of the above approach too, and I'm glad to be on his team, and I'm glad to be on Manhattan's team too as well.
I'm glad to be on everybody's team too. One of my Speaking of my teammates, one of my Manhattan Institute colleagues, Nicole Stell Garnett, has done some really interesting work on the legality of religious charter schools. We've seen this story get some action in Oklahoma recently. I wonder, what do you make of this? And then more broadly, what role do faith-based institutions have to play in education as more and more choice and innovation within the education space gets passed into law in states around the country?
Yeah, so the religious charter school debate is pissing off all of the right people. So, the teachers' unions are upset about it, so it must be a good thing, probably. No, I do remember reading your colleague's piece in the Wall Street Journal, and my knee-jerk reaction was, I'm on her side on this one, so I think she's correct. I don't remember the specific argument that she made, but basically based on precedent from how I think about this, in 2020 and in 2022, we had two Supreme Court victories on school choice, which basically said that, you don't need to subsidize private education, but if you're going to do so, John Roberts said, you cannot discriminate schools solely based on them being religious. So you can make the argument that because charter schools are not run by the government, they are private, independent providers, that allowing the funding to go to non-religious providers, but not to religious ones, you could make the argument that there is a discrimination on the basis of religion. I believe those two school choice cases were based on the free exercise clause. It was more of a First Amendment case than a 14th Amendment case. But you can make either argument as to why you ought to be allowed to have religious charter schools as well. And just as a free market advocate, that you shouldn't take any options off the table. If people want religious providers too, they should be able to have those opportunities as well. So we'll see where that fight goes. I haven't seen a Supreme Court case on the issue. I don't know if or when that's going to be brought up. Perhaps it will. And based on the two victories we had in 2020, which was Espinoza v. Montana, and in 2022, Carson v. Macon, which was out of Maine, two school choice victories have set some precedent. perhaps meaning that this could be a step in the right direction. Another interesting Wall Street Journal article on the intersection between religious freedom and school choice in the public school system is a piece by Philip Hamburger, a professor, don't remember where he's based, but he made the argument that the public school system itself, without school choice, is an infringement on the First Amendment and free speech, because we have compulsory education laws all across the country, and your kids have to go there unless you don't have the money to go somewhere else. Well, you can make the argument that the curriculum in the public schools is compelled government speech, which would infringe on your First Amendment rights as families all across the country, because we have compulsory education laws. I don't know. Even if he's correct, I don't know if that would be politically, because courts are political entities too. Even if you have the right political, intellectual argument, you might not win at the end of the day. But it is nice that someone's making these kinds of arguments too. I think. So
let's take it out of the courts and back to legislation. What is the effective, the best, the gold standard school choice playbook at the federal, state, and local level? Are there any particular examples you like to cite as that's the approach that worked best? This is where we've got to roll it out everywhere.
Yeah, look at Arizona and do what they did. So they've had education savings accounts, which, for listeners, if I didn't make this clear earlier, the government runs schools in this country, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, according to the latest data, spend about $20,000 per student per year. School choice initiatives, including education savings accounts, allow the state portion of that. On average, nationwide, there's probably about $10,000 per student per year. You can take that funding to the government-run school if you want. That's just business as usual. Nothing changes. Your funding continues to follow your student into that government-run school. But if not, you can take that state funding to an education savings account to pay for private school tuition and fees, or any other approved private providers, including homeschool curriculum, private tutors, special needs educational therapies, so on and so forth. The money follows the child through the education savings account. So Arizona had one of these programs. It was the first state to pass one for over a decade before they expanded it to all families in 2022. So they had it implemented on the ground. It was working well. They were able to show proof of concept over time, and it worked out well for them. They also have in their original statute explicit anti-regulation language to lower the likelihood of government overreach in the future, where they call for if you accept the funding, you don't become a government entity. If you accept the funding, you remain private, and that the government can't control your creed, curriculum, admissions processes, and so on and so forth. I don't remember the exact text of the bill, but they do have protections for homeschoolers and private education providers so that they can avoid government strings attached to that funding. Other states are using this language as well. It's in our model legislation at the American Federation for Children and also at the Institute for Justice. We push a light touch approach to where, yes, you have to spend the money on education, but we don't want the government telling you what that education ought to look like. And in Arizona, the program's so popular. You can look at polls every day, but the best metric of a success of a program and whether people want it is people's revealed preferences. Are they actually using it?
I mean, even a Democratic governor wasn't able to gut it.
Right. Katie Hobbs, a hypocrite, went to private school herself, and now she's fighting against it tooth and nail for others. The state legislature is controlled by Republicans, so they were able to keep the program in place. Plus, when you have more people using it, you create a new organized interest to fight against government officials who try to regulate it or to try to get it off the books. Well, in 2021, before they opened the floodgates, they had about 20% of the population eligible. Special needs students, lower income students, and other categories of students were eligible. Now it's everybody. But they already had about 10,000 students using the initiative. In a very short period of time, fast forward to today, from 2022, you went from 10,000 using the program to over 70,000 students enrolled in the Arizona Education Savings Account Initiative. So it's blossomed and the demand is there. In Florida, I think the latest data that I've seen is they've went from, they had over 200,000 students using their initiative in 2022. And then since they've gone universal, the latest data that I've seen in just a couple of years, they've gone from over 200,000 to over 400,000 students using private school choice initiatives in Florida. So people want this. Look at Arizona and Florida for the right way to do it. And there's a lot of states that are looking to those models and implementing them. Last year, we had the year of universal school choice. 8 states went all in. And then this year, more states are on deck. Tennessee has a proposal. Governor Kay Ivey in Alabama, for the first time in her State of the State address a couple nights ago, she said she wants Alabama to be the most school choice friendly state in the nation, explicitly calling for education savings accounts. Governor Bell Edwards in Louisiana, he was a Democrat. He's not governor anymore. He was the only holdup for universal school choice in Louisiana. Now you have Jeff Landry, who won the election recently, and he voted for school choice. He ran on education freedom. He's a school choice supporter, and so it looks like they're going to get the ball across the finish line this year as well. So a lot to be excited about. This is happening, right before our very eyes. We're witnessing a school choice revolution, and it's glorious to see. And it's even more glorious to see the teachers' unions who have been so drunk on power for so long freak out because they don't know what to do when they aren't in control. The control freaks are losing, and it's a glory to watch unfold.
Corey, let me ask you a more general question about you and your methods. You are not the typical intellectual egghead that hangs out at a think tank and sort of just puts out white papers. You are someone who takes aggressive steps to kind of see through your ideas into becoming law. It's a model that I'll just kind of show my cards and say I think is smart and exciting. It's a model that is shared by many of my Manhattan Institute colleagues, Chris Rufo, who we've mentioned a couple of times throughout this podcast, in addition to others here at our organization. How does your activism play into your job as you understand it? And what can this movement of think tanks on sort of the center-right do to cultivate more Corey DeAngelises?
I was trying to find a tweet from one of my friends who told me a long time ago that I should get off of Twitter because I could be doing more important things. I could be writing 50-page white papers that no one's going to read, and those are were the important things to actually cause real change. And I'm glad I didn't listen to him. He actually had a tweet where, just like last year, I had never brought this up to him before either, but he had said something along the lines, and I'm not going to get it perfectly right because I couldn't find the tweet in time, but he had said something along the lines that, a long time ago at a conference, I told Corey to get off of Twitter because I thought his goal was to be well-liked in academic circles and to land a tenure track position. But it turns out that his goal was... If that were
your goal, I would say you're
right,
not doing a great job.
Right, exactly. But then the next part of the tweet is, well, it turns out his goal was to be influential. And so it looks like he actually achieved that goal. And so I was wrong, or it was something along the lines. So this is actually a university professor who I really respect, James Scholes. Look, I started that way. I started as kind of, if I just churn out as many papers as I can, this is how you become influential. That really wasn't the way to be influential. I think it helps, gives you credibility, because you don't just want to have sound bites left and right. You got to be able to go deeper, right? You have to be able to have methods chops and then to be able to point to evidence, know the literature on a topic, and so that people could respect that you have the logical case on your side. You have the intellectual capacity to debate people on the topics when you get into longer conversations about the policy. But you need to get people's attention first. You can't only have the 50-page white paper. You have to also be able to convince people in sound bites, because politics is all about the 2-second sound bites. And one way to learn how to become very effective at doing that is to get on Twitter, which is now X, thank goodness for Elon Musk, with the community notes being slapped on Randi Weingarten for lying about her role in keeping the schools closed as long as possible. But with Twitter, especially in the early days, you only had a certain number of characters you could use. Even now, even if you can put long blogs basically on Twitter, but it'll only show you the very beginning. And even in today's days of Twitter, you need to be able to convince people in shorter amounts of time. And politicians, if they want to pick up the ball and run with your policy, they need to know that they can win debates on the House and Senate floor and sound good. They don't want to make a fool of themselves either. And so if they hear all of these soundbite-based arguments that I've provided on Twitter, they'll be more effective. I've shared plenty of videos of governors saying fund students, not systems, for example, a phrase that I coined. It kind of got away from school choice and towards this idea of fund students, not systems. It's a catchphrase, but it's beneficial in a couple of ways. It's more transparent. It gets to the idea of the money following the student. It puts the other side on defense, and Chris Rufo's really good at this too, winning the language war, he calls it. Well, if you say fund students, not systems, you want to argue with me, then you're in this weird predicament where you have to convince someone, the burden of proof is now on you, why we should fund the system or the building and not the student. Why should we not fund the student? And so that creates a host of problems for them, but it's beneficial in a third way, at least, that it also allows you to bring in analogies to the conversation, which becomes more relatable to people, because Democrats support the same people who vote against school choice or funding students when it comes to K through 12. They support it with higher ed with the Pell Grant, where you can choose public or private, religious or non-religious universities to take the taxpayer money. With Head Start or other pre-K programs, those are taxpayer-funded initiatives where the money follows the student. And you can even take Head Start funding to pre-K providers that are religiously affiliated too. Medicaid vouchers that the Democrats support, you can use at Catholic religious hospitals if you want. The money follows the decision of the person finding healthcare services. And you can go on and on with examples. And for a long time, the main talking point from the teachers unions, they had their 4 words, which was public funds, public schools. My first response to that is they're not public dollars, they're taxpayer dollars. But more importantly, why are you saying this when you support taxpayer dollars, public dollars being used at private everything else? Food stamps can be used at private grocery stores. Medicaid vouchers can be used at private hospitals. Pell Grants can be used at private universities. Head Start funding can be used at private pre-Ks. And you can go on and on with examples. And they stopped using that argument ever since I've kind of gotten into the debate. But that was their main talking point, public funds, public schools. Some of them still do it. And when they repeat it, and I did this in Nashville, one of the protesters at my event, that they were just screaming the entire time. But I talked to them afterwards. And I said, well, hey, do you support Pell Grants for private universities? And she says, yes. And then you could see them in time. They hadn't thought about this before. And they kind of just, it's the meme where they're like, huh? And then they get mad really quickly. The NPC, the non-playable character, they don't know what to say. And then they get mad when they realize they don't know what to say. That's what happened. And she went on to something else. But with some of these protesters, it's like dealing with children because they all just start yelling at you at the same time. But I think you can convince some people at the margins who hadn't thought about it this way before. They won't have the huh and then get mad. They'll have the huh and say, well, if I'm on the fence, maybe the school choice people actually do know what they're talking about. So you need the sound bites to get their attention, but you also need the intellect and the evidence to back up your claims for people who are interested and who are actually persuadable.
Aside from some brief chatter about Randi Weingarten's foray on the Ukrainian front lines, this has been mainly a conversation about American domestic policy. Though I am curious, is there any other country out there that sort of gets this right? The U.S. famously spends an exorbitant amount on of public funds on classroom instruction for K through 12 education with very little return on that investment. What are the countries out there that have more choice, have more innovation in their systems? Is anyone sort of doing this right?
Right, so we're doing it right in red states in our laboratories of democracy that are actually paying attention to voters in the 10 states that have passed universal school choice. So we're doing it right there. But on a nationwide level, we're an international embarrassment. We spend more than just about anybody else. According to NCES, we spend almost $20,000 per student per year. And we're in the middle of the pack in the international assessments, the PISA test, and we spend more than anybody else. You look at Finland, for example, and this is actually really interesting. A lot of the defenders of the status quo will point to Finland, and this actually just happened because we're pushing for school choice in Tennessee. You have some of the Democrat politicians sticking their neck out and trying to make arguments that they don't really understand because they've heard other people make the arguments and they were fed these talking points from the teachers unions. But you have Heidi Campbell, who just got absolutely annihilated on a radio show by a guy named Matt Murphy, who called her out for maybe 30 minutes straight for being a hypocrite on school choice, sends her own kids to private school, won't send her kid to the assigned public school because she said it was a cultural thing, because the private school it felt like it was their community, but then she fights against other families having school choice, and he wasn't going to let her go. But she went on to Twitter and she stepped in it again by saying, look, we should be more like Finland. I replied to her, with a screenshot from the World Bank blog pointing out that Finland has a nationwide school choice system. Okay, is that the part of Finland that you want? Do you want to be more like Finland by having more education freedom and parents getting to vote with their feet? Or is it that Finland spends a lot less than us? The latest data that I've seen that was apples to apples during the same year showed the U.S. at about $15,000 per student, whereas Finland was about $11,000 per student. And if you want to be more like Finland, are you calling to defund the public schools and reduce the per student funding? No, they don't really know what they're arguing for. But there are other countries like Finland, some of the Nordic countries that do have more school choice, certainly, than blue states in the United States. And Ashley Berner, who's at Johns Hopkins University, she calls for something called educational pluralism, which most people would call school choice, people getting to choose schools that align with their values. And she goes over a lot of the international perspective and points out that a lot of other countries have more school choice than we do. She's a better source of information on that than I am. But also even in Quebec, Canada, more close to home, they have a system of public and private, religious and non-religious schools where the funding follows the student. They have more school choice than us in that sense. And if you homeschool your kids, I believe you get about a quarter of the total amount spent per student, and you can use that for homeschooling. So it kind of reminds me of an education savings account kind of thing, where if you don't send your kid to the government school, you can get a portion of that funding for home-based education, or choose among providers that are religious and non-religious in parts of Canada.
Okay, Corey, last question. So I'm Jewish. I'm the product of a Jewish day school education, which was not cheap, and that I know my parents had to make significant financial sacrifices to ensure that they would be able to give me the education that matched their values. My question for you is, say if I am no longer living in New York City, I am living in maybe an environment that is more hospitable to school choice, like South Florida, and if in a 5 to 10 year timeline, I've got my own kids. Mind you, these are two very big ifs, but nonetheless, what am I looking at? Am I potentially going to be looking at a future where I can give my children the kind of education that I want, that matches my values, that is affordable? And is that going to be attainable for me in a way that it wasn't, or that it was much more difficult to attain for my parents? Is that the future we're heading for, at least in some pockets of this country? And if so, is it a safe bet to say that there will continue to be this innovation in the market for education? New schools will open, costs will go down tuition wise, and this is the future we're kind of hurtling toward. Is that safe to say?
Absolutely. Education freedom is the future, particularly in red states. So a lot of people ask me, hey, I live in New York or I live in California, I'm in a blue state. How do I get school choice? What's the best way to do that? What should we do here? And my kind of joke answer is that, well, you can get up and pack your bags and move to Florida or Arizona where they do have universal school choice. That's the easiest way to do so. But there's also a federal proposal called the Educational Choice for Children Act. It is a tax credit mechanism, so it's not federal dollars making its way into the classroom. It's getting your money back for paying for private school tuition and fees, getting some of those tax dollars back. So it's the Educational Choice for Children Act. It has over 140 co-sponsors in the U.S. House of Representatives, including the new Speaker, Mike Johnson. And it has over 30 co-sponsors in the Senate as well, all Republicans in both chambers. Who are signed, all people signed on in both chambers are from the Republican Party. And so that's one way that can happen in blue states. But if you do go to a place like Florida, they already have universal school choice. So you can use the funding meant for educating your kid. I don't remember the average in Florida. It might be about $8,000 to $10,000 per student per year. You can use it at a scholarship to a private school, whether it's a religious or non-religious private school. And you can also use the funding for non-brick and mortar private schools too, much like in Arizona, where you have the education savings accounts, which I think is the future of school choice. It kind of takes school choice towards education choice, because education can happen in other settings than a brick and mortar school. And in Arizona in particular, since they've had ESAs for such a long time, they have a thriving micro school market as well, where it's basically the reinvention of the one-room schoolhouse, where you can get 5 to 10 children on average to get together in a household, where families can economize on the process of homeschooling, much like a homeschool co-op. They have a big provider out there in Arizona called Prenda Micro Schools that's spreading to other states, and they're having so much success that the teachers union, the largest labor union in the country, the NEA, run by Becky Pringle, put an opposition research sheet out on their founder, Kelly Smith, and Prenda Micro Schools. And actually, this was supposed to be under the rug, but the Wall Street Journal editorial board got a copy of it. And they actually made a piece with the headline on the very topic called "The Teachers Union's Tiny Little Enemy." It had a picture of an elephant that was afraid of an ant. They were freaking out because of this new innovation where you don't have to build another brick and mortar school, which also makes this more doable in rural areas. Maybe you don't have to build another brick and mortar school, but you can do some homeschooling co-ops or micro schools. And in Arizona, they've been doing this for a while, so they have it in place. I think we're going to see the market of education change dramatically too, where you might even have kind of like the Uberification of education, where families get on apps to figure out the providers that best work for their kids' needs. And maybe it's in the form of a brick and mortar private school, but maybe it's in the form of a homeschool co-op that aligns with their values too. There's a lot of different ways that this can go, that this can head towards. But I think the way that's going to make it more disruptive in a good way is to have the education savings accounts be the method of school choice that expands, which is what's happening in the states. That we're moving from the voucher approach towards the education savings account approach, which allows families to customize their kids' education in ways beyond brick and mortar private schools. So it's a long way to answer your question, but it should be something that everybody's very excited about, where education is going to be more of a free market going forward based on what we're seeing on the ground today.
Well, it's always great to have a conversation about policy or politics that ends on an optimistic note. I can't say that I have those all too frequently these days. I feel like, Corey, you probably get to have them a lot more frequently than I do, given your issue set. Thank you so much, Corey, for joining Manhattan Insights, and thank you all for listening. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did like what you heard on the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars and writing a review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And be sure to check out future episodes of Manhattan Insights.